Special.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is still the Ways and Means Committee room that we are sitting in, and it is still January 24th. We are going to pick back up H 629 to basically hear an update. We had a number of witnesses scheduled, but in the intervening time since we scheduled those witnesses, I heard from Legal Aid and the League of Cities and Towns that they had sort of in the intervening time have had some group conversations with the Bankers Association and the Realtors Association and some other folks, and are working towards new language of areas that there's agreement. And so would rather not have folks commenting on legislative language that's already somewhat irrelevant. That doesn't seem like a good use of anyone's time. And so I'm inviting the league and legal aid up to give sort of an update on process and where they are with sort of trying to iron things out. They will then come back to us with that new language, and that is what we as a committee will start working on from there. And then, of course, have to iron out some disagreements amongst ourselves and amongst parties and all of that to find a way forward. But just sort of wanted to get at least some of that done before we all were sitting with it. Does that make sense? Okay. We tend to not, I know a lot of other committees do that sort of procedure very regularly, and we don't very often do it in here. So want to also name that. So with that, Therese, do you want to join us and share what you will?
Good morning. For the record, I'm Grace Pasden from Vermont Legal Aid. Apologies, I will be wearing my mask because my household is just getting over a bunch of sickness. And
Thank you for doing that.
there seems to be a lot of COVID in the air lately. So as the chair mentioned, we've had some really productive stakeholder conversations, both with a larger group of stakeholders and some conversations specifically with the league, and have pinned down some areas of agreement and certainly have some other areas where we think we can make some progress. So I'd be happy to sort of in broad brushstrokes kind of go through the bill and give the committee an update about where we are on various provisions. But I did also just want to quickly start by sharing a little bit about how my morning went, because I think it's really helpful to keep in mind why we're here and what this bill is about. We run a hotline at Vermont Legal Aid for distressed homeowners. And just this morning, I listened to 3 voicemails from Vermont homeowners who have delinquent property taxes that they're struggling to get caught up on and are concerned about impending tax sales. And unfortunately, we've gotten to the point in my project where we can no longer happily refer them to VHFA's homeowner assistance program and say, don't worry, they'll throw money at this problem. That's not an option for us anymore. So what we have as an option today is to say, request an abatement from your Board of Abatement, knowing that, and having actually heard from town officials in some towns, we never grant abatements on the basis of inability to pay, or go to your town and ask for a repayment plan. And actually, in one of the voicemails I listened to this morning, the homeowner identified, I've been talking to the town office. They have offered me a repayment plan, but it's $500 a month, and there's no way I can manage that. And sitting here as a working professional in a household of 2 working professionals, I can tell you that a $500 increase in expenses for my household would be a heavy lift, let alone for many of our clients who are financially strapped. So hopefully that kind of sets us in the context for why this bill is so important. But going specifically through the provisions of the bill, the first section deals with abatement. And on page 3, the bill is introduced, proposes adding more stringent requirements for findings of fact and some criteria that boards of abatement have to think about when considering an inability to pay request for abatement. We have come to some agreement in concept around the level of detail that needs to be required in these decisions, but we're still sort of working on this idea of a list of criteria to consider. And I think we have some work still to do with the stakeholders there. Moving to the next section on page 4 of the bill. Again, we have some broad agreement among the stakeholders that it's really important to get clear, plain language notice to homeowners about their right to request abatement and about property tax credits and how to access those resources. The league very astutely noticed that we had not also included this language in the water sewer disconnection notices, which they have proposed this, that there be language in there about requesting abatement because you can also get abatement of those types of charges. So we're certainly in agreement with that, but I do think we still have some work to do on the specific language of these notices, and that's something that we can continue to work on as a group. Continuing along to page 5 of the bill. Section C deals with interest on overdue taxes, essentially from the time of the abatement request until there's a decision. I think we have agreement with the league that there should be a stay on interest from the time that the homeowner requests abatement until decision. They have suggested some language that would make it clearer when that clock would start, which would be, I think, the postmark date or the date that the request is timestamped, and we don't have any opposition to that. So I think we're good on that piece. Moving into the tax sale provisions at the bottom of page 5, there is not broad consensus around what the thresholds should be before a property can be tax sale. So right now in the bill, it's 2 years and at least $15,000. We have not come to a consensus on that. And I think we're just going to continue to have discussions around that and see what kind of progress we can make. We do, however, I think broadly have agreement that, a repayment plan, a requirement that there be an attempt at working out a repayment plan is a good idea. Although, again, as we get further into the bill, there are some more details in the bill as introduced that I think we're going to have to hash out because we haven't quite come to agreement on all of those provisions at this point. Moving on to the bottom of page 6. I think we have complete agreement around the concept of providing 30 days notice, not only to the taxpayer, but also to any mortgagees or lien holders. I believe that's across all of the stakeholders. Everyone thought that was a good idea. Where we still have some disagreement is around the requirement to personally serve notices if the certified mailing has come back. And Vermont Legal Aid, again, feels really strongly that we need to get actual notice to people when you're talking about these serious rights that they're going to lose in the process if they can't cure.
That is an area that it might make sense for this committee to get help from other committees on, because I know both Judiciary and Commerce have spent a great deal of time discussing notice and notice mechanisms. And I don't know if it makes sense for us to spend all of that time discussing notice and notice mechanisms, so we might check with them on that.
Okay, moving along to page 7. I'm not entirely sure where we are in terms of this notice. There was some discussion around the requirement that towns post these notices in the 5 most common languages. And what did seem to be a theme was concern around towns having to do this on their own. And there was some discussion about, is there some state entity that could do the translation and post these notices where towns could just pull them, which seemed in concept like a fine idea from our perspective. We don't really care about the mechanism. For us, it's more about ensuring as much access and likelihood that people are being apprised of their rights. So I think we will continue to have discussions around that. All right, moving on to page 8 of the bill, and I know I'm going quickly. Please feel free to ask questions if any come up as we go along. So subsection C here is where we sort of detail what a repayment plan would have to look like prior to a town initiating tax sale. And I think we have agreement that, you know, it would be that there would only be a requirement that one repayment offer be made to the homeowner, and that if they declined it or failed to make payments under it, that would allow the town to pursue tax sale. I think where we still have some disagreement is the requirement that these particular considerations be taken into account by the town. And I will say, you know, this language comes pretty much directly from the PUC rules that govern disconnection for private utilities. So this is something that private utilities are doing every day and are required to do when you're talking about shutting off somebody's water or electricity. And again, we feel that when you're talking about taking somebody's home, their most valuable asset, you know, it's important to make sure you're taking into consideration factors like, is this at all affordable for this person, in order to ensure that you have a workable plan to try and avoid the tax sale and the loss of their housing. Moving on to section 4 on page 9. And I'm sure the league will correct me where I misstate their position. I've got multiple drafts here that I'm working off, so I apologize. I sort of have to check in to make sure I understand where the stakeholders are at. I believe we do have agreement around adding this this notice of redemption rights into the sale notice. I think the league very helpfully also suggested adding into the notice information again about requesting abatement, and also the opportunity to request that only a portion of your land be sold. But the draft that they had sent over, it ends up being so wordy that I worry that our clients are going to get lost in all the verbiage. And so I think that's an area.
Talking about that earlier today in another context, how like when I get my property tax bill, I like to look at the number and have a little panic and then put the piece of paper down and think.
Right. Yeah. So I think we have to prioritize what's in there and what's in bold and figure out what the most critical pieces are to include in the notice. But I think that's something as a stakeholder group we could likely hash out. Okay, moving on to page 10, which is the redemption section. The first change is from a redemption period of 1 year, which is the current statutory redemption period, to 3 years. There is not broad consensus about extending to 3 years. So this is an area that we're going to have to continue to have conversations around. And now that I look at where I am, I think I may have missed a critical piece. No, I did touch on 2 years and $15,000. Okay, those two are sort of together in my mind. They just happen to be in two different sections of the bill. So continuing on to the interest that's charged during the redemption period, we had proposed tying it to market conditions and to this Treasury index. I think there was broad consensus among the other stakeholders that this would be too confusing because it's a moving target. And I think we've had some, sure.
Craig and Adam, I have you at 2 o'clock at one time and 2:15 at another time, another piece of paper, so I'm sorry. It'll be 2:15. Okay.
So we've had some internal conversations about that, and I think there's a way that we can address our concern that 12% is too high and it's prohibitive in terms of folks being able to redeem, while still ensuring that there's a, competitive interest rate so that folks are bidding, but doing that as a fixed interest rate. So I think we just have to have conversations and see if we can nail down what that right interest rate is that everyone's comfortable with. Oh, the other thing that I should mention, which is not in the bill, going back to the interest rate, is that currently under statute, the homeowner, in order to redeem during the 1-year redemption period, they not only have to pay the statutory interest on the past due taxes, but they have to pay it on any overbid amount. And we had pitched a proposal that the interest only be applied to the past due tax amount. And I think the league, and I'll certainly let Susan speak to this in her testimony, but I think the league is comfortable with that in the context where there is a sole bidder. So essentially the idea is right now, some folks are coming in, they're the only bidder at tax sale, but they're sort of outbidding themselves to get additional interest, right? So the tax debt might only be $5,000, but even though there's not a competitive bidding price, they're bidding $15,000 because now we can earn 12% interest on $15,000 rather than 5. And so we certainly agree that in that context, they should not be able to earn the additional interest. Ideally, that would be, across the board from our perspective. So we'll continue to have discussions about that. And then on page 11, the concept here is that currently there's no notice required beyond the notice of tax sale. So during the redemption period, folks are not required to receive notice of, here's the end of your redemption period, here's what you have to pay, and here are the rights, the pretty serious rights you're going to lose if you don't cure. And so what we had recommended was that annually, every year of the within the redemption period, that there would be a notice that goes to the homeowner. On this date, you owe this much. If you pay this, you won't lose your property. If not, on X date, your redemption period ends and property is going to transfer. I don't think there's broad consensus among the group around that. And obviously, I think this will depend some on where the committee lands in terms of how long the redemption period is ultimately going to be. From our perspective, we think annual notices make a lot of sense. But I do think that there's some consensus around requiring a notice within 90 days of the end of the redemption, kind of a final, hey, you've got 3 months to figure this out. Here's what you need to do. Otherwise, you're coming up against your deadline where you're going to lose your property. So there is some consensus there. I think we still have the personal service disagreement, but it sounds like the committee is going to look into that a little bit. Moving on to page 12. Again, I think there's some concern around having to post this notice in the 5 common languages. I think we can continue to have discussions about what would be the best way to ensure language access and actual notice there.
And there's also just sort of a longstanding disagreement about whether we should put things like warning notice in statute or whether that should happen in some other administrative capacity.
So I think that pretty much covers the tax sale process piece. I don't know if anyone has questions about that before I move on to what I think of as the takings sort of part of the statute.
I think it would be helpful to hear what you.
Okay. Yeah, so I hope folks have had an opportunity to take a look. Yesterday, I sent along the press release for a federal lawsuit that we filed against the town of Barton and Village of Orleans in a case where this is a case that I spoke of earlier when I testified, where our client, who is a retiree living on Social Security income, her daughter and her daughter's partner were living in her property. She received notice by certified mail that her property was going up for tax sale for $6,500 debt. She goes to Florida for a couple of months every spring, which was the timeline for the notice of tax sale. Certified mail bounced back. It got sent back by first mail. She didn't get that either. 1-year redemption period ran. The town kindly did send a notice that they weren't necessarily required to send, but they send it just by first class mail. The following spring, when she was out of town, didn't receive it. She came back after the property had transferred to the town, who had been the only bidder and bid on the property for $6,500. The town has been holding the property since May, and it's a property that the town assessed at $80,000. And, they were taxing the property on that value. And now our client in our current statutory scheme has no way to get back that equity that she lost in her property, a property that she was hoping to pass down to her heirs. Her daughter and her son were essentially forced out when the town shut off all of the services to the property. And so from our perspective, it's really important in light of the U.S. constitutional decision in Tyler v. Hennepin that we find a fair process by which homeowners who, for whatever reason, are unable to redeem and avoid the tax sale process on the front end, at the very least, are not losing tens of thousands of dollars of their equity in their homes. And while, we hope that this case will resolve this situation where towns are the bidder and are holding onto properties, there's any number of other factual scenarios that can and do come up for our clients that wouldn't be addressed by this. For example, the scenario that we've talked about where a third party bids just a little bit above a very small tax debt and the homeowner just realizes that very small surplus. So, our strong preference here would be that the legislature act to ensure a fair process that everybody can understand, a mechanism by which homeowners can receive something equivalent to their equity out of this process. And that's what this section aims to do. And it's what Nebraska has already done. So, this is a model that's coming from another state. So again, there is no broad consensus on this, and you will hear from other stakeholders what their opinion is on that.
I think we need to make sure we have time to hear from the league.
Absolutely. I'm pretty close to done here. I think,
Question for you.
sure.
I'm just curious, what's the time period of that $6,500 tax amount that they owed? Based on $80,000 property, I'd imagine that's multiple years.
I would have to look back at it. Honestly, it was my colleague who was digging in on the records. I think though it was only 1 year because, and I believe it includes water and sewer charges because interestingly, there had been a tax sale just in the prior year that our client had gotten back from Florida in time to redeem. So she paid $16,000 for previous tax debt that had accrued that she was aware of. And then I believe it was just the next year's taxes and water sewer charges that accrued and that she did not receive notice that there had been a tax sale for that and so was unable to redeem in time.
It's expensive part.
They have some really high water sewage rates there. They do.
I guess so.
Thank you for your work on this. I I'm just kind of hearkening back to the initial story you were telling about the person who worked out a payment plan with her town for $500 a month. And I think I agree, that would hit my family. It would impact my family as well. And so there's not a provision in this bill today that talks about what is a reasonable process by which that is negotiated. And I'm just wondering, in your view, if that's something we should consider.
I mean, I think the considerations that we put in, which would be mandatory considerations, think about like how frequently is someone getting paid? What are their income sources? How much is the tax set? The idea there, and again, that comes right out of the PUC rule, is to ensure that towns are considering what is actually feasible for the taxpayer.
Because that taxpayer may very well feel like they have to accept that, and then when they get to inevitably the place they can't pay it, it's going to be like, well, you agreed to this.
Right, and absolutely, I mean, if you have no parameters, a town could say, pay half up front and then pay 3 installments of $1,500, and that's the offer that's on the table, which we know is not going to be workable for someone who's already in financial crisis.
And also, I'm thinking about if that period of time goes on too long, then they're gonna get into another tax year, and then that's snowball, that then the town is disadvantaged as well. So no easy answer, just thinking through the logistics.
Unless anyone else has,
Representative Taylor, and then we're done.
Page 5, C. The overdue taxes shall not bear interest. If the abatement is denied, then the interest is paid? Or
well, interest that accrued outside of the window between the time of the request of the abatement hearing and the decision. So regardless of whether taxes are abated or not, the taxpayer will be held harmless for the period of the abatement process, basically.
So if it's not abated, they decide that they should have paid their taxes. They don't have to pay interest on it.
Yes, under the current provision, that's correct. And because we're talking about a completely discretionary process, from our perspective and in our experience of the abatement process, sort of worthiness or factual evidence of inability to pay doesn't necessarily mean a decision to abate, because under our current statute, and frankly, even under this version, a board of abatement can ultimately deny somebody whether or not they have an inability to pay for any reason. It's still a completely discretionary process.
Okay, one more, page 7. Number 6. Contiguous to the property, does that mean that somebody has not paid their taxes, their neighbors are going to hear about it? And if so, why?
Well, these notices are public in any event. And so the idea here is that the notice has to be publicly posted in any event. And so this is not changing that. From our perspective, this is just giving clearer information about the rights that are at stake and making it more likely that people will get.
So it's just posted, it's not sent to the contiguous neighbors.
No, it is not sent to the contiguous neighbors.
And it's posted in, okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, more than 30 seconds. I told Adam and Craig we were running late. It's fine. Please
Hello,
take
everyone. Thanks. My name is Susan Senning, for the record. I am a staff attorney with the VLCT Municipal Assistance Center, and I've been there about 5.5 years. So thanks for having me today. I'm not gonna read my testimony verbatim, because I just want to go through the points where we were agreeable, because the way we look at it is protection for our members in terms of shared goals. No one wants to see a tax sale. No one wants to see people lose their home. The focus on notice on the front end has pushed a lot of our decision-making in terms of compromise. And so I just want to state that, you know, getting the assistance programs and services on people's radar is something we recommend. So a lot of things, when we answer questions of select boards, clerks, and Board of Abatements, and delinquent tax collectors, is the things we are agreeing to codify are best practices that we recommend anyway. So running through some of those that Grace did already speak to, we are compromising on these suggestions here. So adding clarity to what a written abatement decision must contain, which would codify existing Vermont Supreme Court case law. That was our proposal. So we have that language drafted in terms of explanation. What our members often ask us for is, what does reasonable mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? How do we do it? And so the clearer the statute can be in terms of guidance, the better and more helpful we think it is for them. Revising, as she mentioned, the tax bill backer language to be not only in plain language, but include helpful resources. Right now, it does include the current use, the homestead. We would add abatement to that. I think the general 5 language thing, you know, even I happen to know some things about elections, and when ballots are translated, it is provided to towns by the state. So I think that's sort of an unreasonable request of towns to each do that. So if there's another way, or just for translation services type resource on the backer, that would be helpful. Adding instructions on how people with delinquent accounts can seek abatement, as she mentioned, to the uniform disconnect notice for municipal water and sewer charges. We did propose language, but happy to work on it. Like I said, we just want members to have something that they don't have to sort out and that's inconsistent. We want the language to be, for that notice to be in statute, we would prefer. Stalling interest accrual during the time between abatement and the decision, that's what we just talked about. That's agreeable. Creating a new wait period before a municipality can proceed to a tax sale by adding the 1-year threshold. And then we also would add, and I don't know that there was general agreement on this, but we would add a 6-month threshold for blighted properties. Blighted properties is defined by law currently. And so we would request a sort of half time for the wait period, a reduced wait period for those properties. We talked about requiring municipalities to offer people with delinquent tax bills the opportunity to enter repayment plans. We strongly recommend that. The town is benefited when any amount is paid rather than none. So that is something we suggest our delinquent taxpayers do. There was language in there about a reasonable repayment plan. We will be asked, I know that's a legal term of art or standard that's used, reasonable person standard. We will be asked what is reasonable, and our answer will be it's fact dependent. So we've recommended a written repayment plan be offered. And then we would be okay with a consideration list if it's optional. So may consider the following to provide some discretion, direction. Because, you know, the abatement process is the abatement and repayment plan currently sort of an equitable resolve that's not always consistently applied. I mean, abatement, yes, you have the criteria, but in the end, if a Board of Abatement thinks it would be unfair to the other taxpayers, or for whatever reason, even if they meet the criteria, they do have that discretion and authority to deny it. So a repayment plan that can list specifics on what they should be considering is fine. Requiring those limited funds have to be, I think, takes away some of their discretion, which we would not support. Informing people with delinquent tax bills of their right to request only a portion of the property be sold. That already exists. We're just saying that notice could go in the notice of tax sale, including instructions on abatement. So both of those things added to the notice of tax sale. I think someone's might have mentioned that was to the tax bill, and it is confusing. So we want to limit that and put that in plain language. This would be on the tax sale notice. So we would appreciate language in statute that would be on every notice in the same language. sorry, going back to the previous one, the repayment plans, that's a requirement. We're fine with that. I think the example was the PUC uses it for private utilities, and I think that's Carol, I think made this point, Carol Dawes, on behalf of, maybe herself or the VTCMA, but, it is a little bit apples and oranges because those are private utilities. We're talking about municipalities. So, I think we've tried to craft language that, strikes a balance. We've agreed to increasing notification requirements to taxpayer and lien holders to 30 days up from the 20 and 10. And we don't know that there's a good reason to increase one and not the other, or why it was 20 and 10 different to begin with. I think that's unnecessarily confusing. So 30 days for everyone seems reasonable. Creating a new reminder notice at 90 days prior to the end of the redemption period, something that's annual or more frequent seems like it could be an avenue to, to catch the clerk or delinquent tax collector or the municipality in a procedural error that could really mess things up when, if you're doing earlier notice sufficiently early in the process, and then again at 90 days before the redemption period, you're hopefully avoiding that anyway. And we think that that's reasonable. And then the last thing that we actually caught after our meeting, so I'm going to sneak this in here because I just think it's sometimes overlooked, is the effective date. We would recommend and request that there's clarification that new requirements and changes don't apply to tax sales for which have already gone to notice. So sort of a clarification that once you've noticed one and this bill passes, it wouldn't apply to those, even if you're within and able to reach like the 90-day redemption notice. It would just start with when you on current delinquent taxes that have not yet been noticed for tax sale.
Thank you.
So I am happy. Fact talker, sorry to.
Talking. I think as you all are going forward and as we're going forward, I think striking that balance around consistency and fairness between towns is going to be really important to us. So I understand there's might be lots of disagreement about thresholds and threshold amounts and all of those things, but the more we can ensure that we're doing the same thing from town to town, I think the fairer it is for Vermonters. So thank you.
And I think it makes our lives easier because we don't have taxpayers, clerks, whoever, municipal officials and taxpayers seeing things and wondering, are we doing it wrong? Where do we have discretion? It's a lot easier for people when they just know what's expected and how we can help them.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Working this.
Very
Yes.
quickly. And this doesn't need to be addressed right now because I know we're running behind schedule, but I just looked up the definition of blighted property, and it occurs to me that someone could also still be living in that blighted property.
So much so.
And so, right, so I'm just wondering if we can strike a balance between the needs of the town and the needs of the taxpayer to maybe include, blighted and uninhabited or things, something to consider. I think we can work this out right now before Chair Klein asks.
No, you're good. You're good. This is. Representative Anthony, you have the last word.
Thank you. Just an observation. For those of you who were at the hearing the first time that legal aid came in, I pled guilty as being one of the communities that are very gun shy about going down that road because there's just no guidance. And the other thing, because the statute is silent as to whether this is the beginning of a repeat request, I had suggested that people make explicit that this is for temporary, cannot pay, rather than the statute, which leaves it open-ended. The part that might make that attractive, that is to say it's temporary and the Board of Abatement should look upon it as such, is if there is an equity sharing component to take care of the situation where in the long run, this taxpayer is never going to dig her or himself out of that hole. It's just going to keep going. And you might as well acknowledge that the town really wants it to be habitable, useful, productive property in the long run.
Can I make one comment in response. I think we've heard testimony in the example used about very low amount going to tax sale, a $300 tax sale. And I think there's got to be a story behind that. I'm curious as to what happened there because we always recommend, we have more often than not, I would say, I speak to members who want to offer abatement when the homeowner hasn't requested it. So we get the question of, can we request abatement on their behalf? Or can we just wipe it away? And no, the BOA Board of Abatement has to hold the hearing, but anyone can seek abatement.
The hearing.
So to me, a small amount going to tax sale like that is, is it land? Is it an unlanded mobile home that's vacant that they abated 7 years in a row and are finally just have had it? I would like the story there, but I agree with you that it's hard to know when you get past abatement and to a tax sale.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice.
Appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
Question.
And now we are going to transition completely to get you a chair. Yeah. You can take the good one though, Craig.
Is that the good one?
I don't know.
One way to find out.
We had a second chair for a while. Where'd it go?
So we're going to transition to a discussion of the governor's recommended budget once we get a chair.
Oh, fine. You get it. Oh, man.
And are you all signed in for sharing something you want to share? Adam and Craig, thank you so much for joining us today. Really glad to have you here. I'm sorry we were running a little late.
All right,
The floor is yours.
thank you. Should I join with audio?
No.
Too late.
Oh, mute your computer right now, please.
You share.
Screen. Bottom.
Oh, share screen.
The eternal battle between the legislative and executive branches with different programs.
I think Zoom is like globally recognized to be a better platform. But whatever.
I can't run.
It's for the team.
It almost
It's like share the web.
something.
Yeah,
You should ask one of these guys.
And where's the websites?
38-page summary. This is a good fact.
Good summary. No, it's the 3-page summary. So it's not allowing me to, how do I get to the website? I mean, I see all this show all.
Is that it?
Anyway, you know what? Let's just,
I'm doing some help. You can do it.
just go to the budget language for Ways and Means. Let's just do that. So, that show up there?
You're golden.
Congratulations. You have.
This is somewhat suboptimal
One.
because I wanted to start with the budget
Well,
and show you guys. However, if we, by the way, Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management,
Craig Bolio, Tax Commission.
good to be here. I have to start off with an apology. Normally, our budget has lots for you guys to do, and this year, it's just going to be crickets in this room, I can tell. So there were only actually, in terms of how we formatted the budget, a couple of revenue initiatives, both of which my colleague Commissioner Bolio can speak about it in greater length, but we started with e-board revenue, which you're aware of. We added to that one of the initiatives we did, as we have done for the past probably 15 years or more, is we redirected some property transfer tax revenue into the general fund to boost the amount of available revenue. And we also took about a half a dozen what we call direct apps from liquor and lottery. Well, lottery goes to the ed fund, but from liquor. New this year is sports wagering. That is coming into the fund. We're estimating $7 million from that. Also from the Attorney General Settlement Fund and the like. So those are all typical. Sports wagering is new, but the rest is typical stuff. And then we have some deducts from revenue, and that's typically in past years. We've had a number of requested or proposed deducts. This year, that list is mighty narrow, and it's largely due to the fact that we're trying to prioritize. And we're trying to focus resources on where they're most needed because we have a little bit more constrained resources. So there are two initiatives, tax initiatives of note. The first is from the property transfer tax. There is a request to exempt blighted properties.
Yeah, so this is a proposal. It's in H 719, the housing bill. So this is a proposal to exempt the buyer from property transfer tax when they are buying a blighted property that will be restored for either a homestead or long-term rental within 3 years. They have to demonstrate that to retain the exemption. So we would expect either a homestead declaration or a landlord certificate on that property within 3 years. Available statewide, and our estimate for that is about $400,000.
And would they'd get a rebate of the taxes they paid?
No, so they get the exemption up front, and then we would track it to make sure that we don't have to claw it back. So we do something similar with land gains tax, where there's a builder's exemption where you claim it up front, and then we make sure that we get a homestead on the back end.
How are you going to define blighted? I know it's a much, well, we were actually just discussing that on the.
Yeah, oh, I wish I had Abby here, but we have, there's some definitions in there that I think utilize some of the existing municipal tax exemptions, but unsafe or unsanitary are some of the definitions we use in there. So it's got to have like code violations, something like that, that makes it so that it's not habitable today and that it's going to be fixed up to be habitable.
Like town health code violations or state health?
Let me see, I can try to find the language.
Sorry.
Oh, all good.
I just have to believe it's going to be defined very carefully.
Would you like me to?
That'd be great.
Okay, I think that's a good manager.
From their proposal?
No, just in statute generally.
Oh, so there are like 12, I think there are a number of different definitions
Okay.
of blighted throughout statute for different purposes.
Then I will be signing.
Okay.
I will
Probably a
find this.
version and-
I will find this for you, Madam.
Okay.
The second proposal, it will be a familiar one. I think this committee is familiar with the downtown and village center tax credit, which is in statute, but it's capped in statute at a total of $3 million of credits. And I believe that's first come, first served. In the past couple of years, in part to try to ignite development in various downtown and village areas, particularly in the more rural areas, they've lifted that cap on a temporary basis by, I think, what, $1.5 million?
Yeah, about that, 1.3 maybe.
But this year, fiscal 24 is the last of those elevated caps. So what we're calling for in this budget is to lift the cap permanently to $5 million. It's currently at $3 million, and that's baked into the revenue forecast. We're calling to lift it to $5 million.
And are you hoping it will continue to be offered to neighborhood development areas or just downtown and village?
I don't think there's a call to expand it. That's a good question for
So we did sort of a temporary expansion.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah,
ACCD will.
I'm sure Chris will be in touch very soon about it.
Yeah. I also have
We're still
that
booster.
definition of blighted, Madam Chair, means substandard structural or housing conditions, including unsanitary and unsafe dwellings and deterioration sufficient to constitute a threat to human health, safety, and public welfare.
Those are the only two revenue details. There are a number of revenue additions. I mentioned sports wagering. I don't know if, does cannabis flow through this committee? So.
Abundantly.
Cannabis revenue.
To represent Brattleboro.
So when they set up the cannabis, when they legalized cannabis, there were really kind of three different fund flows, you might call it, for someone who purchases. The first is there's a 6% sales tax, that goes to the ed fund. And in the budget adjustment, there was a call to create a special fund, the After School and Learning Special Fund. They would direct that sales tax directly to the special fund. That is not, because it's in budget adjustment, that is not here. So there's a sales tax, goes to the ed fund. There's an excise tax that travels to, supposed to, as originally envisioned, travels to the general fund. And then there are fees that are paid by growers and retailers, and that goes into the Cannabis Regulatory Fund. And it is that fund that pays the salaries and benefits of the Cannabis Control Board. You'll recall that in last year, as they ramped up the control function and hired a lot of people and rented an office and so on, the fee revenue was not enough to keep up with their costs. So they were running a substantial deficit in that fund. And partly because not only was the industry new and they didn't have all the growers and retailers and so on to pay those fees, but they also kind of took a very, what I would call, there was a kind of a policy-ridden fee setup. They were trying to encourage small businesses, BIPOC businesses, and so on. So
And it worked. It's kind of amazing.
Well,
It's like really quite different from other.
but the fees didn't come in to support the operation yet. So the legislature, and I don't remember whether this was in the budget or the miscellaneous tax bill, I'm not really sure. They redirected all of the excise tax into this fund, the Cannabis Regulatory Fund. And that was to, again, make sure the fund wasn't running a deficit, to pay the salaries and so on. What I think happened was that the industry, as advertised, took off. And excise tax revenue has been beefed. And fees have picked up. So that fund is running in substantial surplus. I don't remember it was something like $1.6, $1.7 million per month. The total budget of the Cannabis Control Board is just under $6 million. So for revenue they took in last year and this year, we're going to end fiscal 24 with a substantial amount of revenue in there, far in excess of what it's going to require to run the Cannabis Control Board. So we contacted them and said, we're kind of hungry for revenue for the budget. I mean, can we redirect it? And they're aware of what we're doing. So we're taking $10 million of this. Next year, by the way, this becomes a non-factor because I think the redirect was only for fiscal 24 and fiscal 25.
It was temporary while
Right.
while things were stood up.
So if you look at actually the e-board forecast, they have a line, there's a line on it for cannabis. I think they're expecting $19 million in 25, but zero of that will go to the general fund because it's all redirected into the special cannabis control or cannabis regulatory fund. So we're kind of taking it back and putting it in the general fund. I wanted to explain that to the committee because that may come before you. I don't know which committee that would be.
And I don't mean this to sound nitpicky, and I fear that it will, but none of these are new revenue policies. They're just things you're doing with existing revenue that's newer revenue based on past legislation, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
This is not,
This
we're
is
not,
like, this is revenue that's coming in because of decisions we've made in the past to raise revenue. Okay.
so we're redirecting. I mean, cannabis is a classic example. Sports wagering is another one.
So you're redirecting 10 million?
And so that's adding to our top line revenue that we are bringing to bear in the budget.
But it's all part of the same big revenue bucket. You're
That's
just
right.
moving around and just the smaller buckets are shifting around. Okay.
Yeah, historically, this committee's been skeptical about redirecting money that's initially directed to a certain purpose. There may be no harm in this. But down the line, I would be, and maybe members of the committee would be, wary of the stated purposes of the revenue ended up doing something else. So I'm just stating this as we work our way through this. Thank you.
So I feel somewhat comfortable in that this actually, it was originally conceived, this revenue was supposed to go to the general fund. It wasn't supposed to go to the regulatory fund. But because the regulatory fund was running in the red and fees, so we're actually, which is why I feel kind of comfortable with this. And by the way, 30% of the excise tax revenue is a 14% excise tax. 30% of the revenue is supposed to be directed towards substance
Education and
Yeah.
avoidance.
misuse, avoidance.
Yeah.
So of that 10 million, there is a $3 million appropriation to the Department of Health, but it's all coming out of the one big pot of general fund. So it doesn't necessarily draw, a direct line, but that's what's happening.
Representative.
I can verify at the birth of this operation in government ops, the whole point was to provide a ramp of financing to get the executive and staff off the ground, and it was intended to go back, if you will, to the general fund. What is yet a future question is how, if the fees stay where they are and things continue to take off, then there's an ongoing redirection back to the general fund.
Right. I think there actually is a structural problem there, and that the fees were supposed to fully support the cannabis control board.
And the excise, though.
Well, no, I think the excise was
Only for education.
Yeah, I think the fees were going into the special fund, and the control board is now of a size that they will never be supported by the fees.
Oh,
They just
dear.
won't. I mean, so there's $6 million.
We will have,
Yeah.
they have requested some adjustments to fees this year, and so we will have them in and discuss how all those things cover each other.
But I mean, it will at some point have to be readdressed.
And it's an ongoing question about, we talked to OPR about this just last week, the public safety pieces of regulation, right? There's the pieces of regulation that are sort of specific to an industry and just serving an industry, right? And then there's the public safety, broader public safety implications of regulation. And should those be covered by the folks in the industry, or should they be covered more broadly by the general fund? And I assume that's the reason you partially backfill special funds with general fund dollars sometimes and don't raise those fees sometimes.
Are there other questions on kind of the overall structure?
Are you on the special,
I was going to move to the language, which you see on your screen, but I'm
Um,
happy to answer other questions on.
So you've done all the big picture things. Okay, any big picture questions from representatives?
I've got two. Certainly housing is something that I think about in my community a lot, and how we can help create more of it. And I know there's been some back and forth about a couple of tax incentives that we might offer to help accelerate housing. And I see some of them here. Are there others that were considered but not included that?
Yeah, well, there's one more that's in H719 that I wanted to raise while here, so maybe now is a good time, and that's a value freeze, 5-year value freeze for property values, so property taxes on newly constructed and rehabilitated residential dwellings. And so the goal here is to have targeted areas, right? So the designated downtowns, village centers, neighborhood development areas, and also the new market tax credit areas. Those are areas set by US Treasury and traditionally are categorized in Vermont for one of two ways, either historical high poverty or low population density. And have it be a 5-year value freeze. So if you were to reconstruct, if you were to rehab a building, it would stay at what is presumably a depressed blighted value. If you were to construct something new, it could be at the land value for 5 years. Have to be owner occupied or long-term rental again. There's an application process and a yearly certification process built into the language through ACCD. So you would have to certify that it's being used for that. Again, the department could do some compliance there, either expecting homesteads or landlord certificates. If you have a multifamily unit, right, so apartment complexes, it requires mixed income. So a portion of the units have to be considered affordable. Again, we have the definition for blighted properties for rehab, so it can't just be that you've got some kind of big remodeling on a luxury property. And it's disallowed in TIF districts because it's a similar mechanism for.
Is that the TIF-like thing the governor referred to yesterday?
I would not call it a TIF-like.
I know, but did the governor call it TIF-like
Stabilization.
yesterday?
I believe that he was referring to the disaster relief investment.
Yeah.
And that is not that's something that Department of Economic Development is taking the lead on.
Okay, and they might bring it to us at some point.
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a different program that's related to, I think, replacing damaged and destroyed buildings. From
And in this proposal, municipalities can already freeze
They could.
values.
Yeah, so.
The idea that we're freezing ed fund values.
That's right. And so, today municipalities could enter into a tax stabilization agreement, which is what I think this program is really similar to. They have all the authority to do it for municipal taxes. They have authority to do it for ed taxes today, but as this committee knows, they have to make up those education fund dollars. So what we're talking about here is that the town would be forgiven from those education fund dollars.
And how much do you expect this to cost?
There's a ramp up period. So in the first year, fiscal year 25, if it started there, we think $1 million.
Like, you're just, I'm thinking about the ed fund a lot.
It caps, sure, absolutely. It caps in year 5, right? And if it's a 5-year freeze, it caps in year 5. And I had those numbers. I think it's in the neighborhood of 15 or 16 million at that point. And then after that, it only grows by inflation, right? Because you can have properties cycling in and out. So as you mentioned, right, we're thinking about the ed fund a lot. I've sort of separated this into 2 different issues, right? We have an acute problem in the education fund this year, which is a significant projected property tax increase. And then we have a long-term problem in the education fund of how to make sure that growth is sustainable. And we're making sure that we've, one, got enough houses for people so that we can improve demographics, but also having proper grand list growth to keep up with spending pressures, right? So at $1 million for fiscal year 25 and a modest ramp up, right? I think this is a wise investment for the long term to be able to fix, not fix, but improve the outlook of the long-term problem, right? And not necessarily add a huge burden to the acute problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if things are moving at the right speed, I could see that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Representative Sims, you had a second thing or no?
Yeah, and just,
Did you have something on this particular topic?
I did.
Okay. You're good. Covered. Okay.
I think you want to stay on the same topic before we go to another.
I just wanted to say I was about to encourage Craig to leave the ed fund out of the stabilization agreement, but you cured it by saying we're going to forgive essentially what the towns would have to pay on the stabilized value.
Yeah. So to be clear too, this program is intended by default to be available in these designated areas for the ed fund value and the ed taxes.
Yeah.
The language does allow towns to opt into that program. I recognize they could do something very similar with tax stabilization agreements on a case-by-case basis, but if a town wants to, they could simply opt into that. And then any of the applications that get approved by ACCD for the ed fund forgiveness would also get approved for a municipal one. And again, that's subject to local vote at the municipal level. And just if I could add, it's also been really interesting because we've tried to look around the country, and it turns out that there's actually a lot of states around the country, most of them at the local and county level, because Vermont's property tax system and ed fund system is a little unique. But there's like 11 states that I know about, including California, New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, that have programs similar to this.
Like at a more local level.
Yeah, but essentially like a value freeze for new kinds of construction where you want it time limited for certain types of property that you want. Most of them, as you could imagine, residential property.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm curious about military retirement exemptions, something that's been put forward a lot in the past and don't see it here. Is that something?
I think this is the first budget. I think the governor's first budget, I want to say FY17, it was not in there. But I think every other budget that he has offered, with the exception of this one, has included that in. Now that gets back to what I said at the outset, that we prioritize. no. That would be a 3 million or more deduct. So, but I can assure you, he didn't do it because he's lost Zeal. He's just.
So we can assume the governor would support that if we move forward with it. Is this like a strategy or like? So
No.
We don't.
I mean, can we assume that the governor would?
Would support. I mean, if you can assume it, yes. I mean, again, he didn't change his mind. Our revenue situation changed. But yes, you can. I did want to take you guys through the language. I spent some time knowing that you didn't want to go through 40 some odd pages, but you do have the language document on your website if you do want to peruse it. I started with what I think will end up in your committee anyway from House Appropriations, but hopefully I picked out most. It starts right with D100, which is the section where we allocate the property transfer tax. There you see the language that we use to reallocate. And it results in taking some of the allocation that would have gone to BHCB, some of the allocation that would have gone to the municipal and regional planning commissions. Some of the money actually comes from Commissioner Bolio's pocket.
Not my pocket.
Right.
Metaphorically.
I had my thumb up as he said that.
So 2% off the top goes to the PBNR special fund.
Yes.
And that 2% is generally somewhere between 1 and 2 million, depending on what the total amount of property transfer tax is. And because we're running such a lean operation over there at tax, I usually around sometime in the fall, I'll dial up the commissioner and say, what do you guys need?
What do you got?
And so he'll say, this is what we need to run the program. And so the balance we will sweep into the general fund. And, this year, I think it amounts to about $500,000, a little less, but in addition, the municipal regional planning commissions, we also actually reduce what would be a statutory, mathematical allocation to the geographic information centers, which run on less than they require. So there's a number of different changes to that. My final comment would be is, in the past couple of years, there has been a fair amount of money that we redirected to the general fund, which has caused a fair amount of dialogue in this building. You'll be happy, in air quotes, to know that the amount of money we're redirecting to the general fund this year is quite a bit lower because the property transfer tax has declined quite substantially. So I think at a peak of maybe almost $70 million, it's the forecast this year is, I think, for 58,100,000. So, there's been a fairly big change in that. But so that's the first that I wanted to point out. The second one is kind of an interesting one. It has to do with populating financial computer system modernization fund. And you guys will recall that last year, predominantly thanks to the work the tax departments did, they redid in statute the formula that would provide revenue into this fund that is used to keep the tax system upgraded. And it was going to be just a straight transfer based on a formula of 0.21% of total general fund. Total revenue. Yep. So that would be this year about $5.8 million, 5.4-ish.
Yeah, in that neighborhood.
That would normally just be a straight transfer. Part of it would come from the education fund because these guys are working, PBNR in particular, on behalf of the ed fund. But the largest component would come from the general fund. So this year we are doing that, but we are, again, kind of looking for other ways to generate or to save revenue. So we're actually doing it from not two different buckets, one direct from the general fund as a transfer and one from the ed fund, but also from a third, and that would be from the local option tax in tax, which has a substantial surplus that's greater than what they need. Keep in mind that fund is for the pilot fund, but it's supposed to be used to administer the pilot program and I think appraisals and listing.
Okay, I would separate that because that fund is the fund that we get for the fees, the per return fee. So the pilot fund is separate. So this isn't taking any funding away from pilot. So we get a $5.96 per town per return fee for collecting local option tax. That goes into this fund. For a number of years, several years ago, we at Tax felt that that fee was too high. We asked the legislature to lower it. You chose not to.
Yeah.
Water under the bridge. But what that did do is that put a surplus in that fund. The fee is now, I actually think, properly calibrated despite not having been lowered because we've been putting more work into local option tax now. And there's more towns that have come on board. So it takes some additional work. So
Gosh, I guess.
ongoing, I think we're okay. But it does mean that we've got this surplus that we can utilize for this to save some jobs. And part of the VTAX system supports collection of the local option tax. So it felt like there was a connection.
So you'll see in the D101 section, from the general fund to the tax computer system modernization, 1.8 million. A little further down from the education fund, 1.4. And then furthest down from the tax local option process fees fund. Great name, by the way. So, and we had
To go
to,
out of their way to be snazzy over at the tax department.
That's us, flashy.
you'll also see some notwithstand language because there is in statute very specific purposes for that fund to use for the. We thought, that is true and we are using it for a different purpose. However, it is staying with the lovable tax family. So we thought, well, yeah. But ultimately, this is a $2 million savings for the general fund, which is why we did it. So anyway, I'm reasonably certain that's going to end up in your committee. And then further down is an amendment, a fee amendment, which frankly, I can only vaguely understand, but I'm sure the member from Thetford will help understand that. It came to us from the Public Utility Commission. It's not a fee change, but I think it's clarification of the existing fee structure. So that you will see in there, which I'm reasonably certain will end up in your committee. And then finally, an oldie but goodie, the HIP fund, the Health Information Technology Fund, that has that fund and the revenue that fuels it have expiration dates, which, as you can see by the long, act, 2013 act of, and then 2017, it's a long history. I'm sure Jim remembers, but anyway, we are again postponing the sunset of the Health IT Fund, and that's predominantly the revenue source for Vital, Vermont Information Technology, which also has some federal match. So I think it's actually a global commitment appropriation. So we're prolonging that fund, and we are prolonging or moving out the sunset of the healthcare claims tax, which provides the revenue for that.
Is that the only, there are quite a few sunsets that are coming up soon that are sort of follow a same pattern of being regularly moved out. Is that the only one that you've put in the budget?
I think there is another one. And I don't remember what it is.
Okay. I'm sure we'll find it eventually.
Now, I'll think about it. Yeah, I'll get back to you. But this is the only one that, as I was going quickly through the language that I saw, but there may be another one, and I don't remember what it is. Much as I hate to say it, that's really all I got for you.
Okay, we will find our way. So
We make up
our
some
way
time
through.
for you guys.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
We are,
Take my screen back.
we are going to the floor and then we are back